We might as well begin since we're here, and a few more people are coming into the waiting room.
Hello, Professor.
Hello, Sana. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good
Oh
to
my
see you.
gosh, I thought it said we didn't have a meeting till tomorrow. I read it wrong.
Now, my apologies. When I set up the Zoom thing, somehow it automatically put the dates on Monday and Wednesday. That's why you were here last night. You were signed on. Did you?
Yeah.
I went into the wrong class. I didn't.
Okay, so you get to the right class. Okay, so I worried. Okay, so yeah. So Tuesday, Thursday, ignore the date it says on Zoom. So good. Any other questions? Thursday, we actually, if all goes well, we have someone coming to show us the Oculus Go cameras we'll be using for our next project to do monuments. So make sure you come for that. And because I don't know how easy it would be to do online. And any other questions? I should say any questions other than, okay. Good. So what did we talk about last time?
Ended on trial of the soldiers in Boston Massacre.
Okay.
They were prohibited with the number of their points.
That's two of them were, yeah.
Two of them.
Good. Good memory. Good recall. Good. So the next year was kind of quiet in Boston, although Boston did make a thing of March the 5th. Of March the 5th, 1771 was a date Bostonians commemorated. And this Friday, in fact, the Paul Revere House is doing a virtual program on, because Paul Revere created these obelisks that were illuminated, showing scenes of the massacre and the death of Christopher Sider. So it's not that this was a big event and everyone automatically remembered it, because as you're probably aware, big events happen and we quickly forget them. Things that we think no one will ever possibly forget, we do. But Boston did make a point of remembering March the 5th. And March the 5th becomes a date Bostonians commemorate and continue commemorating until 1783. And then they switched the commemoration date to July 4th. But every year on March the 5th, there would be an oration in Boston. There would be illuminations, that is, people would make things to light up in their windows showing scenes of the massacre. So Boston actively remembers the events of March the 5th. And also, as Boston is doing this, hey, how you doing, Pablo? Boston is also, or I should say, Boston's town meeting creates a committee of correspondence to write to other town meetings, basically to keep them informed of what's happening in Boston. And other towns in Massachusetts also start these committees. And similarly, the Massachusetts Assembly creates a committee of correspondence to write to the other colonial assemblies as a way of communicating. Back in 1768, which is a very important year for a lot of reasons, the Massachusetts Assembly had written to the other colonial assemblies saying we all need to resist the Townsend duties, and the governor of Massachusetts has suspended the assembly because he demanded they recall the letter. The governor's thinking was colonial assemblies can't correspond with each other. If one colony has to communicate with another, the governor will do that. And the assemblies don't have a role in this. The assembly disagreed, and the governor suspended the assembly, and the assembly responded by petitioning to have the governor recalled, have him replaced. And the British Crown, thinking, you know, it's better to have someone in Boston that they're not going to, you know, keep hating, did replace him with Thomas Hutchinson. So you have this predisposition in Boston, this idea that people here govern themselves. The assembly does have this role, and that's really one of the big stories here, underlying stories as to why the problem starts in Boston. Let me just see, there's another thing happening in this period that I find a little hard to believe. In fact, there are a lot of things here I find hard to believe. And I'm not quite sure why I keep telling you these things and you believe them. But let me tell you, one of the big problems here in Massachusetts in 1771 and 1772, and it involves paying judges. This is a big and important issue. And I know, Logan, do you think this sounds like really an exciting topic to talk about? No. Who would think it? What about you, Amber? You think, boy, I couldn't wait till someone started talking about paying judges.
No.
No. Henry,
I mean, I kind of want to be a judge, but
you want to be a judge, okay. And you didn't know that who pays you is going to be a big issue. But here's what happens. After that trial Henry was telling us about, where these guys got branded on the thumbs, the British Crown worries. What happens the next time we have people doing their jobs like these soldiers were, and somehow they irritate the locals who put them on trial? They irritate the locals perhaps by shooting them, as that had happened in March of 1770. No, we really were lucky this time. We managed not to have these guys charged, convicted of murder or manslaughter and hanged. What happens next time? And so the British ministry, there's a Secretary of State for American Affairs, there is a Prime Minister, of course, there are Lords of Trade. They think, well, maybe what we should do is have the judges paid by the Crown instead of by the locals. That way, the judges will depend on the Crown rather than the locals for their authority, and they'll be more interested in what the Crown thinks. I just realized there was actually a different slide I wanted to show you, so let me see if I can find it while I'm talking about this very important thing. What happens next time? So the British Crown wants to start paying the judges. And 1 second, I will show you this, I hope. So Henry, you're a judge in Massachusetts. You're Henry, right? Good, that's what I was thinking. Oh my God, I'm acting like I know you and if I'm calling you the wrong name. What if you're really someone else? Okay. This is, by the way, what happened in 1768 with the assembly voting, being suspended by the governor. 92 members of the assembly voted against against the governor. 17 supported the governor. If you go into the Museum of Fine Arts, once it's real, has anyone seen this bowl, by the way? If you ever are in the position of being a visiting dignitary and come to Boston and the mayor wants to impress you, the mayor will present you with a silver bowl like this, which is a symbol of Boston. Okay, this, anyone know what this is called? It's actually named for the person who made it. Putting it together.
Well, isn't like when you put your like votes in it?
No, it's not for putting votes in. It's for taking something out of. It's actually a punch bowl. And it was made by Paul Revere. It was actually paid for by members of the, well, Sons of Liberty and other organizations who brought silver to Revere, actually 45 ounces of silver to make this bowl. And this bowl holds 45 ounces of rum. So it's a relatively small as far as punch bowls go. 45 ounces is not a whole lot. The number 45 seems to have some significance. And the significance is this. Well, I should show you the other slideshow on the significance of the number 45. The number 45, okay, you've talked me into it, Henry. Well, if I can't find it, you'll just have to take my word for it. That the number 45, very important, and any minute now, I will be able to show it to you. Maybe not. Okay. There's a British politician named John Wilkes. And Wilkes published a magazine called The North Briton. And the North Briton typically was opposed to whatever the British ministry was doing. Issue number 45 of the North Briton seemed to attack the king personally, which you're not allowed to do in England. So issue number 45 was suppressed by the authorities. Wilkes goes to jail for publishing this. And here in the colonies and other people who support Wilkes use the number 45 as kind of their cardinal number, showing that they side with Wilkes. And in 1769, so about the same time you have this Massachusetts Assembly being suspended, off in England you have John Wilkes being held in prison at a place in London near St. George's Field, and big crowds come to support Wilkes. Troops also come out, wind up shooting into this crowd, killing a number of people in what comes to be called the St. George's Field Massacre. This is a year or so before. We have the troops firing into a crowd in Boston in what, of course, we call the Boston Massacre. So number 45, This punch bowl holds 45 ounces of rum, still weighs 45 ounces itself, 45 ounces of silver. And on one side, it talks about the Magna Carta. On the other side, it talks about the glorious 92, the members of the assembly who voted against recalling their letter. And Paul Revere also has a drawing of the 17 members of the assembly who sided with the governor being ushered into the jaws of hell. So, high feelings in Boston in 1768. And no one here claims to have seen this. If you go into the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which with your Suffolk ID you can do for free, you will see as you enter the American wing, this punch bowl is the first thing you see, right beneath the picture, the portrait of Paul Revere. So this is, by definition, kind of an important thing, an important object, the punch bowl from 1768. Now let's get back to the whole issue of paying the judges. And let's see. Maybe this time it'll work. Good. Okay. So what happens when Parliament decides it wants to pay the judges? Now I remember what I wanted to show you, and I apologize. Okay. The assembly insisted that it had the power to pay the judges, not Parliament. Judges could not accept a salary from anyone else. And what then happened was when the judges went to open their sessions of court, you had crowds gathering in the courthouse demanding that the judges refuse to accept a salary from the British Crown. Now, Judge Davidson, what are you going to do when this mob shows up at the court and says you can't accept the salary from the Crown? Well, would you, so it'd be upset, but you as a judge have to do something other than just be upset. And by the way, if you're a judge, you can never show that you're upset. Charge them with crimes, but again, how? I mean, you don't have, they have force, you don't. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Lily, what would you do if you're a judge and suddenly a crowd shows up and says you can't accept a salary from the Crown? You would be asked this. You know, the judges, I don't know if they knew they were going to be asked this when they showed up in court. And here is the thing. Samuel Adams, whose portrait you see here, which you'll also see in that same room in the Museum of Fine Arts, was he was the clerk of the assembly. And he also is the leader of the Boston town meeting. His father was a businessman in Boston. Samuel Adams. And by the way, if you learn nothing else in this course, you should know no one ever called him Sam. He was Samuel. If you were close enough to him, say to be married to him. Otherwise, he was Mr. Adams. And he was not a brewer. He did not make beer. He did make malt, which is an ingredient in beer. His father had a lot of businesses. One of them was a malt house. So he is not the happy brewer of the Revolution that you might have seen on beer bottles or beer cans if you've ever been in a place where you might see beer bottles or beer cans. There's also no recorded instance of Samuel Adams ever cracking a smile. So he is the leader of the Boston town meeting, and here he is as the leader of the assembly. And this portrait, which is also in the Museum of Fine Arts, was actually paid for by John Hancock. It's a portrait by John Singleton Copley. And I apologize for not having a bigger image of it. What's he doing in this portrait?
Is he pointing towards something?
He is pointing towards something. Yes, exactly. And you know what the something is? The Massachusetts Charter of 1691. And according to the Massachusetts Charter, it is the prerogative of the Assembly to pay the judges. It's also the prerogative of the Assembly to say where it will meet and when it will meet. The governor, Thomas Hutchinson, had been saying the governor should decide this because in Britain, the Crown opens sessions of Parliament. So the governor should determine when and where the Assembly meets. And Adams is saying, no, the Charter says the Assembly decides this. So he is pointing to the Massachusetts Charter. Having this written frame of government is a very important thing. You can't see what the document in his other hand says. You see in his other hand, he's holding a document. And if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, you'll see it says instructions from the town of Boston. Adams is a representative from the town of Boston. The people who elected him have the power to instruct their representatives. Now, Parliament operates on a different idea. Parliament operates on the idea that members of Parliament are there to think about the good of the empire as a whole, not to think about the narrow group who of 51% of whom elected them. But in Massachusetts, members of the Assembly are there to represent particular groups of people who elected them. Very important concept of actual representation. Parliament operates on virtual representation. Everyone in the empire is represented by virtue of the fact that Parliament, members of Parliament, and by the way, they're not called representatives, they're called members, are there to think about the good of the empire. However, a representative in the Assembly from the town of Boston is there to look out for the interests of the town of Boston. A representative from Dedham is there to think about the interests of the people of Dedham. A representative from Brookfield is there to think about what? Brookfield, exactly, yes. So much different idea here. And Samuel Adams is pointing to the charter, saying that's where the power comes from. And in his other hand, this is where his power comes from, the people of the town of Boston. And his hand is resting on the minute book, that is the proceedings of the town meeting of Boston. So that's very big, important thing. And the Massachusetts Charter also explains who gets to pay the members of the Assembly. And it is not the Crown, but it is the Assembly. Now, when these crowds show up at the courthouses and demand that the judges refuse their salaries, every judge in Massachusetts agrees that we won't accept a salary from the Crown because the charter says the assembly pays us, not the Crown. Every judge except one, and the one who doesn't is Peter Oliver, who is the brother-in-law of Thomas Hutchinson and also the Chief Justice of the Superior Court. Okay, so you've gotten every judge to cave in. What do you do about Peter Oliver? Any ideas? Oliver, by the way, is a iron manufacturer from Taunton. And actually being a judge is not that lucrative a thing for him. He loses money by being a judge. It's not, Henry imagines being a judge now is a lot more dignified than it was then. As a judge, you travel all around Massachusetts, which extends from Maine down to Cape Cod. Some places have courthouses, some don't. When there's not a courthouse, trials are held in the biggest public space available, which usually is a room in a tavern. That has some convenience because when you're traveling, you're also going to stay in a tavern. So you as a judge now are usually sharing a bedroom with the lawyers who are also hearing cases. All of you travel around hearing these cases, and most cases you hear are not that exciting. They involve really what to you as a very wealthy iron manufacturer are kind of the mundane concerns of farmers and mechanics and merchants, the petty kinds of problems you might see aired out every day on Judge Judy. Okay, so it's not like this is an exciting thing. And Oliver says he loses money by being a judge if he really wants to, if the Crown wants to give him an extra 200 pounds, that doesn't make up for what he loses by this stint of public service. Should he accept the salary? You're saying no. Why not? So
Because of what you get from the Crown.
okay, but he's losing money by doing this.
Yeah, he's rich.
Well,
He does not do it. He just kind of do it.
but it's a duty. I mean, he's been appointed to do this really burdensome thing. He's doing it out of civic obligation, and now you're begrudging him being paid for it. Rich people too have, and I hope one day, Henry, Seth, when you're rich, you'll understand it.
I don't know if that'll happen.
That you'll be rich or that you'll be more sympathetic to.
I don't.
Okay. Anyone else? So what can you do about a judge who says, I'm going to take the money because it doesn't come close to making up for what I lose by being a judge?
You pay him more than the Crown is.
I guess you could pay him more than what the Crown is, but if what you're trying to do is show he's a bad guy, because as Seth said, he's already rich, you're probably not going to say, oh, we'll pay him more than the Crown does to make a, well, a good point. We want to increase your salary. By the way, judges' salaries still are an issue because it's up to the legislature to pay them. And well, you kind of can see the problem. Anyway, one member of the assembly says, well, what we can do here, we've shown the charter specifies who pays the judges. Judge Oliver is taking money in defiance of the charter. We can impeach him. And the other members of the assembly say, we don't really think that'll work. Because if the assembly has never impeached a Crown official before. Second, if we impeach him, that is, the House of Representatives impeaches him, then the trial would go to the governor's council. And presiding over the governor's council is Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, who is incidentally Mr. Oliver's brother-in-law. And the secretary to the governor's council is Andrew Oliver, who is Mr. Oliver's brother. And what Governor Hutchinson will do is say, the assembly does not have the power to impeach a crown official, and that's the last we want to hear about. And that is exactly what happened. But when the members of the assembly tell John Adams, who proposed this is what they should do, he says it doesn't matter. We'll impeach him anyway. And they do. And the important thing that happens isn't that the council throws it out, but that when Mr. Oliver, Judge Oliver, goes out to Worcester to open a session of the court, the jurors come in, the people who have been called to jury duty, and they look over at the judge and they say, you've been impeached by the assembly. We can't serve in this court until the matter has been resolved. And having the matter kicked out of the council isn't resolving it. So the jurors in Worcester walk out of the courtroom. Has anyone here been on jury duty?
No.
You're supposed to be, you walked out in protest because you didn't like the judge? Oh, got canceled. Well, if you ever are called to jury duty and you do walk out of the court because you don't like the judge, you're probably going to wind up in jail. Now here, Oliver, by the way, Peter Oliver later wrote a history of the Revolution, and he thought the whole problem was Boston. But he goes out to Worcester and people there aren't going to sit in a court he presides over. So this is kind of a problem. Well, it's a big problem. It really shows a change happening in the way people think about their power over their government. Another big thing that happens in 1773, this is just to give you the context, because if we were just doing the highlights version, probably wouldn't mention either of these things, and maybe in retrospect, I shouldn't have brought up either one of them. But early in 1773, in January, Governor Hutchinson opened a session of the assembly, and the assembly was meeting in Cambridge because there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston. And Hutchinson thought, relatively calm period, what I can do to calm things down further is explain to the Massachusetts Assembly their role in governing Massachusetts. And Governor Hutchinson, Hutchinson was really an historian. In another era, he probably would have become a history professor. In fact, he was writing a 3-volume history of Massachusetts. He had in his home, when it was ransacked by the mob in 1765, lots of documents he had collected for the 3rd volume of his history of Massachusetts. And the mob took these documents and threw them out into the street where they could get trampled by people and pigs and cows. And one of his friends said, apparently, no one wanted to read another volume of his wretched history. This is a friend of Hutchinson's. And in addition to writing long, boring books, you've had some observation of history professors. What do history professors do?
Broad question.
Okay, so the ones you have seen in action, have you seen other history professors in action? And what is it that we tend to do?
Talk a lot.
Yes, okay, we talk a lot. Yes, good, good. In what particular way?
Lectures.
Lectures, yes. By the way, this is kind of another, along with not calling him Sam, my general advice to citizens is don't vote for college professors, because what we really like to do is talk and talk and talk. And also, every college professor is always certain that he or she is not only the smartest one in the room, but the only one who should be talking. This is what makes faculty meetings so horrible. And we really like it. We know you're really smart if you write down everything we say. And at the end of the semester, you agree with what we have said. And if for some reason what you say is in disagreement with what we have said, we don't take that as a sign of your independence of thought. We take that as a sign of your stupidity. And so we will repeat what we have said using smaller words and speaking more slowly until you get it. These are the characteristics of college professors, at least in my observation, which might suit them, terrible for politicians. Now, Governor Hutchinson opened the assembly in 1773 with two very long lectures about the role of the Massachusetts Assembly in the British Empire, the conclusion of which was that the role of the Massachusetts Assembly in the British Empire was negligible. It is Parliament and not the Assembly that governs the empire. The Assembly of Massachusetts does not govern Massachusetts. That is the role of Parliament. And the Assembly has two choices in this matter. One would be the wise one, which is to submit to the will of Parliament and recognize that Parliament governs the empire. The only other option is, anyone know? Governor Hutchinson certainly didn't ask the Assembly, raise your hand if you know what your other option is. The only other option is to declare independence. And if Massachusetts were independent, it was an independence which would not last very long, because very quickly Massachusetts would come under the governance of a less beneficent empire than the British Empire, under which they enjoyed unparalleled freedom and protection. They would become subject to the French Empire or the Dutch Empire or the Spanish Empire, and then they would lament the lives they had lost under the British Empire. It's a compelling argument. Now, suppose you're members of the Assembly. How are you going to respond to this when the final exam comes? He's just told you this is your choice. Submit or declare independence. See, the problem for Hutchinson thought, A, this will convince the dullards in the Assembly of where they stand. B, when people in London read this, they'll thank me for making this case so plainly. People in London are really kind of horrified because up till this point, no one in Massachusetts has said, we want independence. They said, we want to enjoy our rights as Englishmen. We want to enjoy the relationship we have long had with the British Empire. Now, Governor Hutchinson's telling them their only choice is either to submit to Parliament, which they have said they cannot do, or declare independence. So this is another problem. Now, what the Assembly then does is the same thing they did back in 1768 when they had their quarrel with Governor Bernard. They ask that Hutchinson be replaced as governor with someone with whom they can get along better. And they send this request to their agent in London. And their agent in London is someone who grew up in Boston, ran away as a teenager, and now has been in London as the agent of the Pennsylvania Assembly. He's actually been in London now for about 12 years, enjoying himself. And he is probably the most famous American of this era, Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin gets this request from the Massachusetts Assembly, which will require a hearing before the Privy Council to determine whether or not Governor Hutchinson should be recalled. And what Franklin really is thinking is, if we replace Hutchinson with someone who can get along with the Assembly, we can save the empire, rather than saying, okay, your choice is submit or declare independence. Now, are there any questions, by the way, on where all of this is going? The big news of 1773, so far we have paying judges, where the Assembly meets, who should be governor, and The other big news is this. A man named Thomas Wheatley died. Were you even aware, Lily, that Thomas Wheatley had lived? No. So what's the big deal about Thomas Wheatley dying? Well, Wheatley had been the secretary to Charles Townshend, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer back in the 1760s, and Townshend had proposed a series of tax measures that provoked rebellion in Boston. And Wheatley was puzzled as to why there was rebellion in Boston. And so he wanted to find out. So he wrote to some Bostonians asking why people there were upset. And one of the Bostonians he wrote to was Governor Hutchinson. And Governor Hutchinson, who was then lieutenant governor, thought this was a great opportunity because now you had someone in a position of power in the British Empire asking him what he thought. And Hutchinson did tell him very candidly what he thought about what was going on in the empire. And so between the mid 1760s, shortly after the Boston Sons of Liberty had ransacked Thomas Hutchinson's house, and the early 1770s, when Thomas Wheatley died, Hutchinson wrote to him, giving him insight into American affairs. And Hutchinson also wanted to make it clear he knew how wrong these people were who were talking about protecting their God-given rights. You can't expect, Hutchinson said, that you can move 3,000 miles away from England and still enjoy all the rights of Englishmen. And he also proposes some solutions to these problems. Maybe they should be crushed a little bit, and then they'll appreciate the liberties they have. In 1772, a British customs ship, the Gaspee, had been forced to ground in Narragansett Bay, and the locals had burned it. And Hutchinson thought, round up the people who did that, bring them to England and have them stand trial. And the sight of a few of these hooligans in executioner's dock will pacify the rest. So these are all in the letters of Thomas Wheatley, and he dies. His executor happens to live next door to where Benjamin Franklin is staying, and he knows about this dispute with the assembly, and he thinks, well, Franklin would probably be interested in what Hutchinson was saying to Thomas Wheatley, a person in a position of power. And Franklin sends Wheatley's letters, or the Hutchinson letters, back to Massachusetts. He sends them to Samuel Adams, who's the clerk of the assembly. And he says, these are private letters. Under no circumstances can they be made public. They are for your information only. You know, if you write a letter, it remains your property, and the person who receives it can't publish it without your permission. I mean, that doesn't do a whole lot of good. If you've tweeted something or put something on Facebook, then it's pretty much fair game. But Hutchinson was writing letters under the assumption they would remain private. And if Franklin sends them to the assembly, theoretically with the idea they're going to remain private, but Samuel Adams knows what to do with private letters. He has the assembly chamber locked, and then he has the letters read aloud to the members of the assembly. Now, they're not taking notes, but they hear certain phrases. Maybe they have to be crushed a little bit. You can't expect to enjoy all the rights of Englishmen. The sight of a few of the hooligans in executioner's dock, phrases like that. And after about 3 weeks, as members of the assembly are then going out and telling their friends and constituents what they heard, Adams announces, we found another set of the letters. that don't have the same strictures of privacy, so we can publish them. And this becomes probably the best-selling document ever published by the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the letters of Thomas Hutchinson, which pretty much ruin Hutchinson's reputation. He asks permission to be allowed to go back to England so he can plead his case in late, and he does leave. Well, he leaves after the next episode. So this is actually the background to what's happening here. This is the news in Massachusetts in early 1773 is about this big fight between the assembly and the governor. It's not really big news in London. No one in London is really thinking about Massachusetts in this period. No one in England is. You know, here in Boston, here in Massachusetts, we often have the idea that the whole world is watching what happens here. But I know most of you are not from around here. And before you came, how much time did you spend thinking about what was happening in Massachusetts or in Boston?
Not a ton.
Not a ton, yeah. What are you, Pablo? You, no, yeah. Lily, what about you? No, no. Okay, well, the big news in London is another part of the empire. India. Between the 1690s or so, when the British East India Company was founded, and it was set up actually as a rival to the Dutch East India Company and a French East India Company to monopolize, get the trade of India. India was wealthy. This is where, you know, in fact, it was the wealth of the Indies that had first propelled European powers into colonizing the Americas. And what happens in the 1750s is the East India Company really begins to consolidate its control over India, doing this by making agreements with local rajas, local princes. You know, the East India Company sends over accountants to manage basically the company's affairs. And the company is trading goods from in India, as well as getting tea from China, and has this tremendous trade that makes it the wealthiest company in the world. Now, what it's doing is taking over administrative duties for local rajas, saying, you know, we'll take care of things like collecting taxes and other things, and you can go on being a Raj, which sounds like a good deal if you're one of these Indian princes. And the company sends over an accountant named Robert Clive, and Clive, very good accountant. Anyone here want to be an accountant? Clive not only is a very good accountant, he winds up running these principalities in India, commanding armies, because some of the other rajas in India don't want to be governed either by the Raja whom the company is supporting or by the East India Company. And thus they don't go along, which means Clive has to raise armies and fight them. And by the early 1770s, the East India Company has taken over control of much of India, you can see on the map, and has become the wealthiest corporation in the world. This is a picture of its headquarters in London, the East India House. And Clive, by the way, has become one of the wealthiest men in the world, returns home to London. And what happens when you become one of the wealthiest men in the world, and you had gone off to India as a humble accountant? Can anyone predict what's going to happen? Are people in London going to say, good for him? He saw his opportunities and took them. He helped to subdue India. Or are they going to say, there must be something wrong with the way he acquired this vast fortune, launch an investigation, and poor Clive, who's a great accountant, great warrior, commits suicide under this big scandal. Okay, now, our important point, though, isn't the story of Clive, although it's an important cautionary tale. I'm glad that none of you wants to be an accountant, because now you can see where it leads. But this, in acquiring control of India, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, because none of this came cheap. And there were a series of bad harvests in Bengal and other problems. And so the company, largest corporation in the world, is on the verge of failure. And they go to the prime minister, this man, Lord North, and they ask for a bailout. If the British government can loan the company 10, 15 million pounds, it will get the company through a really bad spot, stabilize it, and then the company will go on being a great thing for the British Empire. And Lord North sees a great opportunity when he sees one, when one is presented to him, I should say. And what would you do if you're Lord North? Amber, what would you do if the company comes to you with this idea? You'd give them the money. Will you get anything in return?
I'd ask for something.
Okay, good idea. Yes.
An ownership stake.
An ownership stake, was that what you would ask for? Yeah, okay, so yes, Parliament will give the company 15 million pounds, but the Prime Minister gets to appoint the board of directors, which is probably better for Lord North than it is for the company. So the company now is pretty much owned by the Parliament, which has just bailed it out. And knowing that the company has this temporary shortfall in its income, the Tea Act, which Parliament passes in 1773, the important thing about the Tea Act is that it bails out the company. Another piece of it is the company will have a monopoly on all tea sold in British North America. Back in 1768, when Parliament had passed a series of tax laws, in 1770, Parliament had repealed those tax laws. There had been protests, and plus the tax laws hadn't really amounted to much. Now, Parliament says, okay, actually, in 1770, when they repealed the tax laws, they left in place the tax on tea, which meant that Americans who were buying and drinking tea, if they were buying tea from Britain, they had to pay taxes on it. Most tea sold in North America was not coming from Britain. It was being sent by the Dutch or the French. American traders would go to the West Indies and get tea in Martinique or Guadeloupe or St. Croix islands, which were not under the control of the British Empire. So this is what the Tea Act does. Okay, also, because now we want to make sure the tax sold in British North America is sold by the East India Company, we'll only have certain merchants in America allowed to sell tea. In fact, we'll designate the merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, Baltimore, who will be allowed to sell this tea. And here in Boston, one of the largest tea merchants was Richard Clark, the elderly gentleman you see here. Here he is with his daughter, her children, son-in-law. And it happened that in the summer of 1773, Clark's son was in London trying to buy tea. Found out Tea Act means you have to be designated by the company, so the Clarks do get a designation to be tea merchants. Others from Massachusetts who do are Thomas Winslow from Marshfield, Benjamin Faneuil, the brother of Peter Faneuil, and Elijah Hutchinson and Thomas Hutchinson Jr. the sons of Thomas Hutchinson, the governor. So the Clarks are designated tea agents. This is Thomas Hutchinson, and these are the Hutchinson letters. This is Almanac of 1773, showing Hutchinson, the devil, and death. You can see this is what they're saying about him in the press after the publication of the letters. Okay. So, when actually in late summer of 1773, Jonathan Clark returns home to Boston, having purchased or gotten designated to buy tea. His house was, let's see, actually they were living in a rented house. The Clarks were just on School Street. If you're familiar, are you familiar with School Street? It's one block that way. And it's where the old City Hall stands. And here it is, School Street. And this roughly was the home of the Clarks. And a mob approached that night, family reunion at the Clark house, and suddenly they hear a mob outside. They hear the loud whistle of a guy named Joyce Jr. They hear people shouting different things about the tea and about the Clarks and the East India Company. And then they hear the shutters and shingles being pulled off the house outside. And someone fires a gun out the window and the crowd disperses, but the Clarks have been warned. And then the next day, there's a rally at the Liberty Tree and a town meeting at Faneuil Hall, to which the Clarks are invited. And the town meeting tells them they have to resign as tea agents. What will you do if you're the Clarks? Do I ask too many questions about what you would do in this situation? Would you prefer I just tell you what they did? And
Sometimes it's fun.
okay.
They probably resign if they get their shutters pulled off.
Yeah, they might resign. What they want to do, they go to the old State House, where the governor's council is meeting, and they tell the governor's council that the provincial government should take possession of the tea. And the governor's council says, we don't want to have anything to do with the tea. You're really on your own. And so you have this background here. One thing that happened, by the way, we know a lot about this episode because it's one of the most famous episodes in American history and certainly in Boston history. But there are other ways we don't know what happened because we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. It seems, if you look at this record, the first episode you have is a crowd trying to pull down a house. Someone fires a gun and the crowd stops. That's the last time there is physical violence during this whole episode. Somehow it is clamped down. If we're going to have the same kind of mob behavior that we saw in 1770, you're going to have a much different outcome. So far, it's kind of a hypothetical what is going to happen or what might happen, and it remains so until the end of October. But meanwhile, in other colonies, for example, merchants in Pennsylvania, particularly the merchants, especially the merchants who had been selling tea, but now are shut out, really worry, okay, they think we can prevent the tea from landing here, but we pretty much know what's going to happen. In Boston, those people are so conniving and self-interested. What they will do is allow the tea to land and then send it here and sell it to us. So the merchants in Philadelphia publish a circular letter to the merchants in other colonial towns saying we should not allow the tea to land. So that kind of puts pressure on Boston and these other places about what is going to happen with the tea. And in September, just try to make some sense of this. Under the Tea Act, the tea can't go to North America unless there is a well, it's kind of a complicated accounting problem about how much tea there has to be in the warehouse before the company is allowed to sell tea in North America without paying the tax. And the moment comes in September of 1773 when there is enough tea in the warehouse. That is, tea does go bad. You can't sell it beyond a certain date. And so if the tea remains stockpiled in the warehouse, it's going to go bad, then it won't be good for anyone. On the other hand, Parliament doesn't want the tea going to North America and being sold without paying a tax on it. So you're trying to balance the interests of the company versus the interests of Parliament here. And as I said, Parliament's really not thinking about Boston, Massachusetts, the American colonies. They're thinking about the East India Company and these cargoes of tea. And the moment arrives in September of 1773 when they have to send the tea or it's all going to go bad. And they send the tea by finding ships that are already going to North America, and they are all American ships, or mostly American ships. There is a big ship that is going to Charleston, South Carolina, and that ship can carry about 9,000 pounds of tea in about 600 or 800 chests. A chest of tea weighs 200 pounds. So you can do the arithmetic to figure out how many chests of tea that is on this cargo ship. There's another similarly sized ship going to Philadelphia, another going to New York. There are 4 smaller vessels going to Boston. Each one of these is going to carry about 200 or so chests of tea or pounds of tea. Okay, so you have the ships leave London in September of 1773, and it is just by chance that the first of the ships reaches Boston at the end of November of 1773. This is the ship Dartmouth that reaches Boston in November of 1773, and immediately the town meeting springs into action. The town meeting appoints groups of men, 25 men, who will stand watch, each watch of 12 hours, on this ship to make sure none of the tea is unloaded. And they actually bring the ship and tie it up roughly here at Griffin's Wharf. And then the ship Beaver arrives, same thing happens to it. The ship Eleanor arrives, and the ship Jonathan actually wrecked on Cape Cod. They send someone down to get the tea off of it, but the locals have already taken most of the tea, as well as anything else salvageable from the ship, and are, well, selling it. They're thieving people out on Cape Cod, apparently, who are not abiding by this. So you have these ships now in the port under guard by locals. And we then will have a series of meetings at Faneuil Hall, which is where the town meeting happens. But so many people want to come to these meetings, they move them to the Old South Meeting House, biggest building in town. And every night there's a meeting here to determine what will happen. The sheriff comes to one of these meetings and declares this is an illegal gathering. Everyone has to leave. And the 3,000 people crowded inside hiss at him. I don't know if you've ever had 3,000 people hiss at you. It really unnerves the sheriff, who's kind of a timid man anyway. And we know that there's another clock ticking. This is a legal problem. Here's the legal problem. Under British law, a ship can remain in port for 20 days and it doesn't have to unload its cargo or pay taxes on anything that's on it. Because the presumption is the ship might be sailing someplace else and just stopping here if it's in port for 20 days. But after 20 days, the presumption is the ship is going to be unloading and selling stuff. So then everything on it has to be taxed. That's kind of the clock ticking. Is the ship going to be here for 20 days or longer? And day 20 is going to be the 19th of December. Okay? So that's the clock we know is starting to tick. And what we in Boston want to happen is for the ships to leave, take the tea with them, bring it back to England. Now, this is going to be a bad thing if you're the ship owner, because you've just brought this ship here. You have to sell the tea here, take the receipts back to London, and then the company will pay you. You didn't get paid anything for this voyage. You had to undertake it because of the Tea Act. I mean, you might have had other cargoes you could have gotten in London. So you really are kind of stuck. This man here is John Roach, who is a ship owner from New Bedford. He owns one of the ships. And he comes to one of these meetings. Oh, by the way, before we get to Mr. Roach, the guys who were the tea merchants had been ordered to come to one of these meetings. The meeting had ordered them to give up the tea. And they had said, no, we can't give up the tea because it's not really ours. It belongs to the East India Company. It was just entrusted to us. And the town meeting adjourns. Until that happened, these tea consignees knew they were dealing with the government of the town of Boston. Now they're just dealing with 4,000 really angry looking people. And then the town meeting, when it does reconvene, declares that if they don't give up the tea, they are enemies and they can be basically assaulted on sight. So the consignees actually leave Boston. Most of them go out to Castle Island to be under the protection. There is a British ship out in the harbor. One of them actually, Thomas Hutchinson Jr., goes down to Plymouth, where his wife is from, and she is 8 months pregnant. They arrive, a delegation comes to them and says, you can't stay here. This is December of 1773. His wife is 8 months pregnant, and they've arrived during a raging blizzard. And he says, well, can we at least stay the night because my wife is pregnant? And they say, well, yes, you can stay the night. They're back at 7 in the morning, demanding to know why they're still there. So these guys who had had the bad sense to become consignees of the tea find out that they have become public enemies. And the tea is sitting on these ships. As I said, our friend Mr. Roach says, I'm going to lose from having this tea sent back to England. And Josiah Quincy, who is one of the lawyers who had defended the British soldiers, whose nickname is the Patriot, says that Roach has a point. Why don't we take up a collection to pay him the expenses of bringing the tea over? And he says, I'll pledge £100. And someone says, you talk really nice, Mr. Quincy, but you don't show us your money. You have this allegation that Quincy's now being bribed, as the town, or I should say, some sentiment in the town wants the tea to go back to England without paying the tax. And by the way, there's not yet a sign of the tea anywhere else, except in Charleston, South Carolina. Cargo of tea arrived there. It was so far away, no one else knew about it. And there it was taken ashore, put into storage. It doesn't get sold. Okay, now on the 18th of December, the crowd, actually there's a meeting at Old South, and in order for the tea to sail, they have to get the permission of Governor Hutchinson. He doesn't believe he's authorized to let the tea sail, lets the meeting know this, and from Old South, when the word gets back that the tea ships won't sail, crowd goes down to the waterfront, and over the space of several hours, destroys the tea. 9,000 pounds of tea. By the way, one of the tea ships also brought Phyllis Wheatley's book of poetry, which had been published in London. She is the first African-American woman to publish a book. It's actually published in London, published in 1773, and it arrives on one of the ships. And also streetlights arrive on one of the ships, streetlights for Boston. One of the, by the way, the crowd who goes down to the wharf to unload the tea are guys who know something about unloading cargoes. They do it very quietly, very quickly. Guys go below, attach ropes to the chests, hold them up above. Other guys on the deck of the ship cut open the crates with axes, dump the tea and the crates overboard very quietly and methodically. It only takes about an hour or so to unload this tea. One of the ships, the captain had said, don't start with my ship because there's another cargo on top of the tea. I don't want anything to happen to that. And these guys say, we'll take care of it. They very carefully unload the other cargo, place it on the dock, and then destroy the tea. Also in the course of destroying the tea, someone on one of the ships breaks a lock. Someone goes to a locksmith in town to have the lock replaced because they want to make it clear we're only destroying the tea. Someone on the dock observes a guy, actually, he had cut the lining out of his pockets, and he was appearing to scoop up tea that had fallen onto the deck of the ship and toss it overboard. He's actually scooping it up and putting it in to fill up his coat. Someone sees him doing this on the dock and calls out to other people, he's stealing the tea. So he starts to run. They grab his collar. He pulls himself out of his coat. They take the coat and cut the lining out, dump the tea overboard, and then next day they announce in the newspaper that if the person who left his coat wants to retrieve it, he can find it nailed to the whipping post in town. I don't know if he ever did retrieve it. Now, as this tea is going overboard, it's low tide. The tide has started to come in, and it's a very calm night. And these mounds of tea start rising like islands. People go out in rowboats to destroy them, to push them under the water so the tea won't be salvageable. And as these crates of tea pile up next to the ships, guys go down to break up these chests so that they won't simply pile up. It's a very methodical. There's even a British, as I said, there's a British warship in the harbor, and the British captain is watching this operation, and he also notes how methodical it is. And then Paul Revere carries the news of this, which is printed that night, down to New York. He reaches New York 2 days later, and on the day before Christmas, the news arrives in Philadelphia of the destruction of the tea in Boston. At the same time as the tea ship bound for Philadelphia enters the Delaware River. And Boston has instructed the other colonies into what should happen with the tea. It should be destroyed. You can't let it land. Otherwise, you'll be governed by the East India Company and the Parliament. So we have to refuse the tea. And this tea ship that arrives in the Delaware River is told to stop at the town of Chester. The captain and the master of the cargo are brought ashore. And on the morning after Christmas, they come to the State House in Philadelphia, and there are 5,000 people waiting for them to tell them the tea has to turn around. And the captain says, I'd really like to help you out, but I don't have enough food or water to get back to London. And they say, we'll take care of that. So the people of Philadelphia supply enough food and water for that ship to return to Philadelphia. So with the destruction of the tea, Boston has indicated what should happen with this act of Parliament. And John Adams says that this is the most magnificent movement of all. people should never rise without doing something grand and to be remembered. So it is one of the high points. It's a nonviolent action, a destruction of 9,000 pounds worth of tea in Boston Harbor. And Parliament is going to respond by shutting down the government of Massachusetts, closing Boston Harbor, suspending the charter. Parliament in 1774, when it gets news of the destruction of the tea, decides to get tough. So that's what happens in 1773 with Boston and the East India Company tea. Are there any questions?
Are we going to talk about our monument projects?
On Thursday, we will.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, then I will see you on Thursday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you, Professor.